Hello, good morning, and welcome back to Recharging the Human Battery here on AM 950 Radio. Dr. Sinacropi has been holding down the fort by himself for a bit, and it is back to me today. So we're switching spots. I just got back from spring break, so I'm still on Florida time, but here we are. And it's been a while since I have done one of these episodes, so I thought I would take a chance to come back to the ABCs of concussion. If you remember, we've done A, B, C, and D. So today would make letter E. So for today, I have, again, a handful of topics for you, starting with the letter E that relate to concussion and or TBI. And as you know, again, as we've talked about on the show here, concussion is a form of mild TBI, meaning traumatic brain injury. So if you haven't watched or listened to the previous episodes of the ABCs of concussion, it's a really good one because our big thing on this radio show is trying to educate you on how to be the CEO of your own health, take care of yourself. And if you've had a hit to the head or some other sort of injury that maybe kind of jostled your brain around inside of your skull, you may be left over with symptoms that you don't know exactly what's causing them or why they're there. Or maybe you had an episode that you didn't really think of as being a head injury, but now you have these symptoms. So again, this is why I'm doing these ABCs of concussion, to try to give you an idea of what might be causing your symptoms, why you might be having them, what things that you might be able to do. Again, we're not giving out true medical advice on the show here, just giving you some information and educating you a little bit about this topic that really is a very important one. The concussion TBI has been identified as a silent epidemic. It's happening. About a quarter of all adults in the United States have had a traumatic brain injury to some extent. Back in March, I went out to Washington, D.C. for the National Brain Injury Awareness Conference and Day out there. March was National Brain Injury Awareness Month. So we just finished that up, but it doesn't mean that we're going to stop educating because that's my job. So here I am again talking about the concussion ABCs with letter E today. So things that we'll be talking about include emergencies, employment, energy, exercise, EMDR, empathy, emotional dysregulation, and education is my last one. So here I am educating you guys. So to kind of give you a little bit of taste of what we're going to be talking about, if you've listened to some of those previous episodes, you know I've talked about a lot of different things so far already. But in the case of emergencies, my first E on here, the main concern with concussion is a head bleed, which we actually talked about back in B with bleeds. That would identify a serious concussion or TBI. And the symptoms that require emergency evaluation for this, and it's important because we're heading into new sports events. So if you have an athlete that might have a potential for a head injury, these are things that would require you to go to the emergency room or call 911. If there's loss of consciousness, especially for more than 1 minute, or the inability to wake up or stay awake, that would be something to call 911 for after you've had a potential head injury. If you develop seizures, if you have confusion or increasing or inability to stay awake or unusual behavior, if you have a headache that's severe or increasing, if you have repeated vomiting, double vision or loss of vision, one pupil larger than the other, weakness, tingling, or burning in the arms or legs, balance problems or walking problems, slurred speech, clear fluid draining from your nose or ears, or obviously a visible deformity to the skull. So if you are in a sport or not in a sport and you potentially have an injury that causes any of these symptoms, absolutely get in and get evaluated. It's important to identify that real big emergency and make sure we're kind of ruling out some of those big things happening. So that's just a taste of what we're going to talk about today. Lots more topics to come after the break. But in the meantime, here we are on AM 950 Radio with Recharging the Human Battery. Welcome back from the break. Again, we are on AM 950 Radio with Recharging the Human Battery. I am Mandi Dickey, the co-host. extraordinaire, nurse practitioner extraordinaire, as Dr. Sinacropi likes to call me. He is out today. I am here talking about the ABCs of concussion again, picking up where we had left off with previous episodes when I've come on and done this little series on the ABCs of concussion. Again, we've covered A, B, C, and D, and today is letter E. So before the break, I was talking about emergencies. The next E topic I wanted to cover is employment, and this one is kind of a tricky one for someone who's had a brain injury. It can be very difficult to gain or return to employment after you've had an accident or some sort of event that caused a head injury. There can be cognitive impairments, physical, emotional, or behavioral issues that make it difficult to have really any kind of employment sometimes. Some of those environmental barriers that might also be present include stairs. If somebody has a physical deficit after having a brain injury, those stairs and long corridors or long hallways can be a very big deterrent to getting back to work. Someone might have lack of transportation. After they have a head injury, they might have difficulty driving, so getting to work might be difficult. And even trying to navigate the public transit system might be a difficult thing to do for someone who's had a brain injury. And then there's other people's attitudes. And I think we might have talked about this a little bit before on one of the episodes, but other people's attitudes can play a huge role in this. As brain injury is an invisible disability, people don't often see the things that go on inside the person's head that make it difficult. You can't necessarily see that somebody's having a really tough time trying to stand upright. You can't necessarily see if someone is having difficulties with their cognition, if they can't understand, if they can't read things very well, or even understand the verbal language very well, meaning you can't understand what other people say because your brain connections are not firing on all cylinders. I mentioned before the break that we just got back from our vacation. We went on a ferry boat ride, and there were some 5-foot swells on one direction of that ride. Trying to stay upright when you've had a brain injury that kind of throws off your equilibrium is an interesting thing. I did end up with my knees down on the floor of the ferry boat at one point because the waves were so big and I could not stand up straight. And then I watched all these people walk around me that didn't have any brain injuries and they had no problems. So that was probably a little bit more visible, but I don't think people understood why I couldn't stand upright. So other people's attitudes can be huge in that they don't understand. And that's part of why I'm doing this series, to try to educate anyone out there who might be listening. And if you have anybody else that you think should listen to this show, please refer them to listen back into it, because there's a lot of really good information every week. But, I'm a little bit partial to this ABCs of concussion series here. So getting back to the employment issues, if somebody is looking at getting back to work after a head injury, they might require some sort of accommodation to get back. Again, it's an invisible disability, but it's still a disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, does require employers to provide reasonable accommodations. Unfortunately, on this one, and really with any injury, I always say it's up to the employer what they will consider reasonable. It might include taking extra rest breaks. You might need a later start time or an earlier finish time, meaning you have shorter days. You might need to temporarily transfer to a different position while your brain is healing if it's something that's going to be unsafe for you, or you can't quite do the work that you were trained and hired to do. You might need reduced screen time, and that's going to be something that's important for everybody after a head injury, is reducing that time that you spend on screens, because it's very hard to focus. The bright lights make it difficult for you to focus as well. You might have to have reduced driving or physical activity during that recovery time, and limited or no use of machinery or heavy equipment. So that can really affect your job. If you are a heavy equipment operator, for example, and you've had a head injury and now you can't work that heavy equipment. There are things like assistive technology that people can use, such as screen readers or magnification software, that can help make that computer work a little bit more tolerable. You might need access to sunglasses, earplugs, headphones if you're bothered by lights or noise. And it's usually recommended that you start gradually back into work. I don't think I have really ever talked to anybody that said, oh yeah, just 100% go back to doing what you're doing and try, because that just kind of sets you up for failure. So it's really important that you go back at a speed that your brain can handle as you're still trying to recover. So that might mean that you have to return to part-time work or work from home if possible to remove some of those overstimulation possibilities with all the lights and sounds and smells and everything of at work, while you're trying to let your brain heal and get back into doing what you're normally doing, so that you can get maybe part-time back into the office and part-time at home or whatever, if that's a possibility in your line of work. Again, rest breaks, shorter work days might be beneficial. You might also need to just take some time off of work, and that could look like using short-term disability, long-term disability, using your FMLA if you are able, and we have talked about that previously with our disability back in letter D. One thing that I wasn't really aware of was the vocational rehab services. It is funded by state and federal governments. So again, with the culture of where it is, where we don't know what finances are going to look like, some of these programs might be on the chopping block, unfortunately. So if you have any pull with your representatives, now is the time to reach out and try to encourage them not to chop some of these programs, because it's really important to have that vocational rehab service there in case somebody is injured and needs help getting back to work. Because, again, the impairments are often invisible, there usually needs to be a rehab physician and neuropsychiatrist that help to provide those the proof that you have impairments from a brain injury and that you meet criteria for admission to a vocational rehab program. And talking about just in general trying to get back to work after a brain injury, roughly 40% of individuals who've had a brain injury are stably employed 3 to 4 years after their injury. I'm going to say that again for you. Roughly 40% of individuals are stably employed 3 to 4 years after injury. 23% are unstably employed. So the rest of that 20 some odd percent, can't do math in my head at the moment, are not employed at all. So that's a huge number of people who are either unstably employed or not employed at all after a brain injury. Again, that ability to drive is strongly linked to stable employment. If you have difficulties with your vision that impairs your driving, if you have difficulties with cognition, with response times, any of that makes it unsafe for you to drive, not being able to get to work is a definite hindrance to being able to work. And when we're looking at all of the studies that give these numbers, that data remained very similar from 2003 all the way to 2019. Any research that looked at how much or how frequently people were able to get back to work after a brain injury said approximately those same numbers, that 40% were stably employed. Again, that leaves another 60% that's not stably employed. If you have 23% of that is unstably employed, meaning they're on and off again having their jobs, that's still a huge number that is completely unemployed after having a head injury. And that puts pressure on our entire system. We need those state and federal government programs in order to help these people who are not able to get back to work. There is a question that comes up to me of why these people can't get back to work, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. But really, any of these symptoms can prevent you from getting there. There was one PubMed article that I found in 2020 that noted 68% of moderate or severely injured people and 84% of mildly injured individuals were back to work following their injury. But it really didn't break down the stable versus unstable employment. So if we're kind of looking at that, it's still very much the same numbers as those previous reports had been. Of this 2020 study, though, it showed that only 16% had a complete return to their work by 12 months. Another 24% had accommodations still at 12 months, and 67% of them had either reduced work hours or were less content with their jobs. Again, this is a huge number of people after head injury that aren't able to be stably employed, enjoy their work, get back to their full-time positions, not need accommodations, all of those things. That's a huge list. And of those that return to work, just under half of those return to their former jobs. So that's over half of the population of individuals that have a head injury that are not able to return to the job that they were working at the time of their head injury. There was a 2022 article that I found in the Journal of American Medical Association that took a deeper dive into the role of accommodations in getting individuals back into the workforce. So it identified that individuals who are not provided workplace assistance or paid leave can result in decreased annual income, financial instability, and that can cause persistence of post-injury physical and psychological symptoms. Meaning, if you are stressed about your finances, you can't get back to work, that actually limits your ability to recover. And without proper education and follow-up, individuals with mild TBI have increased risk for seclusion, misinformation, negative feelings surrounding their condition, enabling post-concussion symptoms to persist. Again, if you have stress about not being able to get back to work, that makes things so much worse, and it actually slows your recovery, meaning that you're not getting back to work even less than you potentially could have before. So what can we do instead of this? We can offer assistance. We can offer accommodations that will actually get people back into the workforce. So ideas for employers that might be listening. Try to make sure that you have programs to help support individuals after they've had an injury, whether it was workplace injury or not. They still need accommodations in order to get back to work so that they can get better, get that financial assistance. Because as I've found out very much the hard way, it's hard to get assistance when you need it. And the restrictions on that assistance are so thick that, again, it's very difficult to get that help. I think I mentioned before when we talked about the disability that my husband made just slightly over the cutoff for financial assistance for a family of 5, and that certainly did not meet our bills. So it definitely did play a role in slowing down my recovery until I got mental health help to get through some of that stressful times. Because again, looking at this employment, it's very difficult to get back to work if your brain is not in the right area, and you can't heal if you're stressed. So that said, moving on to the next letter, letter E for energy. And we did talk about this a bit with activity and tolerance back in the letter A, so the very first episode that I did in this series. But there is a general decrease in both physical and cognitive energy following a brain injury. This can look like just feeling tired, weak, exhausted, even after minimal activity, feeling irritable and upset, which leads to headaches and increased forgetfulness. We see a lot of cognitive fatigue, which I know that I have covered as well back in the C letter. That can look like, again, trouble concentrating or thinking clearly, making more mistakes, having difficulty finding your words. And the big thing to do with this, again, I'm not going to go real deep into this one because I've covered it a lot in both the A's and C's and D's. I think I've covered this one quite a bit. Conservation of energy. So we'll just briefly talk about what to do. Conservation of energy is really, really important and very much overlooked in somebody that's recovering from some sort of a brain injury. It's important to take regular breaks before you think you need them. Because if you keep pushing, thinking, oh, I'll just be fine, I'll just push a little bit harder, it's going to take you longer to recover. So take regular breaks before you think you need them. Plan and prioritize how to use your energy. And I will say that this one is a little bit easier said than done because your triaging ability might get affected. Mine did. So I had a little bit of difficulty trying to triage what kind of activities I needed to do at different times to make sure that I had enough energy to go around. This is not a renewable resource at this point. It is very much expendable, and you have to use your energy wisely. The big thing also is to identify triggers and work within your limits. And this is one thing, again, that I struggled with for a really long time, is trying to identify what those triggers were that made me a little bit more exhausted and where I lost my energy. And really, again, a lot of it comes down to stress. So if you are physically or cognitively challenged, it will make your stress level go up. Meaning if you have to think about things for a long time, and thinking about things might just be looking at a menu at a restaurant to figure out what you're going to eat. There are times that is incredibly overstimulating for my brain, and that's very taxing, and I will get exhausted just from that. So trying to conserve energy is a difficult task. If you know that you have something big coming up later on in the day, maybe take things a little bit lighter in the morning. And really, really, this is the time to listen to your body. And I know we talk about this a lot on the show too, but just realizing who you are, what your limitations are, and really listening to your body is very important, whether or not you've had a brain injury, because we all tend to push ourselves to our limits. And while maybe that can be an honorable thing to do in some situations, for the most part, you're just putting more stress on your body than you need to. So listen to those limits, identify those triggers. Light exercise. I know we've talked about this before, and I'm going to talk about exercise more in a minute. Light exercise can help speed up recovery, but too much can slow it down. So you have to find that fine line between how much exercise is good for you and how much is too much and actually slows down your recovery. And then working on improving sleep will also help that energy level. So trying to make sure that you get 7 to 9 hours of sleep at night. Take a nap if you need to during the day, but you need that sleep time because, again, that's when your brain heals best. And then I will go much more into fatigue whenever I get to the next episode covering letter F, because fatigue is always big. Exercise, then kind of leading right into that next letter E. Exercise is also another one that has changed over time. We used to say no physical activity until your symptoms went away. And that probably worked fine when we thought that most people got better within a few days to weeks. But we know now that 30% of individuals have persistent post-concussive symptoms. So if you stop doing any kind of physical activity until your symptoms go away, you may never become physical again because some of those symptoms do not go away. So that's not really a realistic expectation anymore. There is a lot of lack of evidence to support holding off on activity anymore until symptoms resolve. And in fact, exercise can speed up recovery, as I just mentioned. You don't want to jump in too quickly, though. You do need to slowly increase your activity as you can tolerate. And you do want to avoid any strenuous or contact sports until you're cleared, meaning your symptoms have gone away enough that you can tolerate that. Again, if you don't stop at that point, if you get another head injury while your brain is still recovering, that's when you potentially have permanent damage to your brain. So we don't want that to happen. So no contact sports until you're cleared. And then as you're trying to increase your activity, stop and rest if you have symptoms such as headache, dizziness, nausea, or confusion that get worse. That doesn't mean that you're going backwards. It just means you're finding your limit. So you're finding your new limit. What's your new limit now? And so kind of work yourself up. If you have those symptoms, back off a little bit. Once those symptoms resolve again, then you can pick back up. And I noted that as I was getting back into my running. I maybe had to slow down and walk a little bit till the symptoms kind of cleared up, resolved, and then I could start to jog a little bit on that same route. Monitor your heart rate. Avoid overexertion. Again, that's going to tell you that you're doing too much. Light exercise is good. Gradually increase as your body is able. Again, listen to your body. And exercise intolerance is related to autonomic nervous system dysfunction, as we talked about way back in the A's. Again, if we kind of look at the deep dive for those that like the deeper dive into this, ventilation is low, which means you're not getting good oxygenation. That leads to rising arterial carbon dioxide levels, and that is associated with the symptoms that limit your exercise performance. So you have not enough oxygen, too much carbon dioxide in your blood. You can't tolerate those activities because you don't have enough oxygen circulating. So this is why things like the EWAT, the exercise with oxygen therapy that we do at Hypercharge, and things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy are providing beneficial treatments because that's increasing that oxygenation in your body, helping your brain heal faster. So both of those are really, really good things to look into. EMDR then. I kind of hinted at this one in previous episodes as well. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This is something that I have really kind of been preaching a lot since my own injury because it really is helpful for any kind of trauma recovery, whether it's PTSD related to a car accident, sports accident, whatever that might be, or other traumatic events as well. So EMDR is not limited just to TBI treatment, but the trauma related to it. So again, if you were injured, or the person that's injured was related to a car accident or some sort of traumatic event. Athletes have this happen a lot. They end up with PTSD from a traumatic event during their athletic activity when they encountered that head injury, and then they might be scared, kind of subconscious level, scared to get back into that same level of competition because they're worried that the same thing is going to happen again. And it's really important to get through this EMDR, this traumatic part of it, so that your brain can heal. And I will explain more why in just a moment here. So what happens during this EMDR is you talk about aspects of the traumatic event. You don't have to go into great detail with it, but you do have to engage in it somewhat while your eyes are moving from side to side, or whether you're engaging in some sort of bilateral stimulation. So typically there's this light box in front of the person, and you're literally watching this light move from to the left and right while you're talking. It helps to keep you grounded while you're talking about that traumatic event, so that your brain doesn't think that you are actually in the traumatic event again. And again, that kind of keeps some of those symptoms down so that you are grounded and you can reform how your brain stores those memories. When I first tried this, I could not watch that light going back and forth. So we did the bilateral stimulation. Pardon my lack of words today. Bilateral stimulation. So I did tapping on either side of my body. We either did arms or legs, and it kind of got the same effect where it keeps you grounded in the now while you're going through that traumatic event. Again, the aim is to change how that memory is stored in your brain, so it's no longer seen as trauma. You're no longer having it recreate every time you get in a similar situation. And it can really get you good relief from those PTSD symptoms, even in a matter of months. So just a couple of months. Mine took about 3 months. It is one of the most researched and most used methods of treating trauma. There is a natural information processing that occurs in our brain during REM sleep. You've heard of REM sleep. That's that sleep area of sleep that we always talk about, that it's really important to get to that REM sleep. And ideally, you're getting like 2 to 3 hours at least of this REM sleep, ideally 4 if you're getting a good night's sleep. So 40 to 50% of your sleep at night should be REM sleep. If you have some sort of sleep tracker, take a look at how much REM sleep you're getting. That's when this natural processing of any kind of event happens in your brain anyway. That natural processing gets interrupted with some sort of traumatic event, and it gets trapped in the limbic system. The limbic system is where we get a lot of our emotions from. So we develop maladaptive processes, and trauma can be reinforced through any kind of triggering event. So that's why if you have some sort of traumatic event and you have other triggers that bring it back on, you've created this negative loop in your body. So anytime something like that happens, it triggers that same event to happen again. So you really need to get down to the nitty-gritty of what's going on in your brain. That's where that dual attention or that bilateral stimulation or following a therapist's hand movements or a moving light or listening to some sort of audio stimulation, all of that mimics that natural information processing that occurs during REM sleep, so you can reprogram your brain. That's why this type of therapy is actually more effective than just talk therapy. Talk therapy, you're not really getting to those natural processes. You're not getting down to the activities that happen during that REM sleep while you're awake. It does require a lot of verbal narrative around the trauma. So sometimes there are very powerful emotional releases that occur, meaning you're talking about that traumatic event. You can end up breaking down crying during the event. You have to know that that's something that might happen. So you're going to be working very closely with your therapist. It requires a lot of preparation and frequent reevaluation. When I did my EMDR therapy, we had to create a safe space in my brain before we went to the trauma. I'm an outdoorsy person. I love being out in the woods. I love the sunshine, the sounds of nature. That was my safe space. There was a creek out in Montana that I have camped next to, and that was my mental safe space. I would go there anytime I was feeling overwhelmed by my symptoms. So we would talk about the trauma, talk about it, kind of work through it a little bit, work out those feelings. And if I was getting overwhelmed or I needed a break, my brain would shift to my safe space and we would take that break. So it does require a lot of communication with your therapist, a lot of prep work. You don't just dive right into this. You need to do this with a trained therapist, somebody who's certified in EMDR therapy. But again, it can be very effective in just a matter of months. And it's really important to treat this because if you have TBI and PTSD, it actually slows down your recovery. So it's really important to address that, to acknowledge it, to treat it so that you can move forward and you can heal. The next E letter I want to talk about then is empathy. And empathy is another interesting one because damage to the frontal lobe, especially the front part of your brain, can cause a lack of empathy after a brain injury. Empathy meaning you can understand other people's feelings, emotions, you understand what's going on, you can read situations, you can read people. And with these disrupted neural pathways, you can have trouble recognizing and understanding how others are feeling. So you might be saying things that hurt other people's feelings and not know it. You might laugh at inopportune times. You might cry at inopportune times. So you might have difficulty accurately interpreting facial expressions, body language, emotional tones. You might not get sarcasm quite so well. So it can lead to arguments if somebody's being sarcastic and you don't realize that that's sarcasm and they're not just being rude. There was another study that in a comparison of TBI patients to controls with psychological evaluation and EMG, the electromyogram, when they put little needles in your muscles and they read what's going on in your muscles and look at your stress levels, the TBI group showed reduction in the ability to empathize emotionally, and they had reduced psychological response with exposure to angry faces, meaning they didn't understand the angry faces. They didn't understand the emotions that they were presented with, and they both physiologically and emotionally. So when they did the neuropsych part of the testing, when they did the EMG part of the testing, even their muscles didn't respond the way you would expect them to when seeing an angry face. So this leads to impaired social functioning, meaning when you get together with other people, it's impaired communication because you're not understanding what they're saying, what their body language is telling you very well, and it can lead to a lot of confusion, a lot of upset. There was another study that I found that evaluated emotional empathy following TBI and found a high frequency of low emotional empathy scores. Again, meaning it's very common to see this low emotional intelligence. And they had that, again, without that relationship to the severity of the injury or their neuropsychological performance. So this could be a mild TBI, moderate, severe TBI, didn't really matter. That didn't say the degree of their ability to understand emotions. And when I say neuropsychological performance, there's a huge 3 to 4 hour neuropsychological test that looks at your cognition, it looks at your memory, your ability to do different tasks that they have you do. And you can score fairly normal on that exam and still be limited in cognitive function and limited in your ability to empathize because that's not tested on that test. And when we look at these tests, there's a wide range of normal. So some of the things that I tested on were low normal, whereas my psychologist said, given my level of education and experience in healthcare, should have been much higher on some of those. So it doesn't always show up as impaired on that neuropsychological testing. So neuropsych's performance, severity of the injury didn't make a difference. People with TBI absolutely have a decreased ability to empathize and understand the emotions and expressions of other people. How to get around this then, how to work on it. Cognitive behavioral therapy can definitely help to kind of retrain some of this. And it's just some simple things like mindfulness meditation can actually get your brain in a better healing spot. Is it going to fix all of the empathy issues? No. That's where the cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. And then managing anxiety and depression, because those go hand in hand with head injury quite a bit. Again, with the PTSD, with things like that. So managing depression and anxiety, managing the stress level will actually let you feel emotions better also. So when you're not constantly in this fight or flight anxious level, you can understand people's emotions and their conversation better. So again, things to work on with that. There are ways to work around this. It's not that that's where you're stuck with now. Emotional dysregulation, then another big one here. And this one, when I was first making up this list, I kind of laughed a little bit when I remembered to put this on there, because this is something that has definitely been a hindrance for me moving forward. So the fact that it took me a little bit to remember that it even existed was kind of funny. So I chuckled to myself on it. When we have somebody that we're talking about brain injuries, it's really, really common for people to have depression and anxiety following a brain injury for multiple different reasons. It can be because they have worsened symptoms. It can be because they can't get back to work. It can be just a functional change in the brain, a hormone change in the brain because the neurotransmitters are affected. And now we have depression and anxiety regardless of whether or not somebody has symptoms left over. So again, so many different reasons. We've talked about anxiety and depression both in the ABCs so far. But again, just highlighting that there is an increased risk of that anxiety and depression, and that leads to a lot of emotional dysregulation. So we can see a lot of mood swings, a lot of irritability, some temper outbursts, and the emotional lability, meaning somebody who's emotionally labile means that you can go from happy to sad in about 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, right? So when you can easily switch from one emotion to the other, and it really doesn't always have to make sense. It can be people with brain injuries can be easily set off by very simple things. They can have exaggerated responses to situations. This is something that has definitely gotten better for me over time, but there are still times when I never used to have road rage, but early on, man, the road rage was a real thing. The struggle was real there. So if somebody did something stupid on the road, pardon my choice of words there, they did something not so smart on the road, it was really easy to kind of get into a spiral and get upset by that. If my kids did something that was maybe slightly irritating before, it was a huge irritation now, and it was something that I definitely had to work on over time. But that adjustment can come because of changes to independence after a brain injury, from changes in family roles. Again, society can cause emotional stress, like we talked about before, where people just don't understand. It is an invisible disability, so a lot of people don't see the struggles that go on in the brain of somebody with a brain injury. And of note, people that have depression and anxiety prior to their injury may experience worsened symptoms after that traumatic brain injury occurs. And again, as I mentioned, TBI that is coupled with PTSD does lead to poor cognitive and affective outcomes following a traumatic brain injury. Meaning if you have both of those and you're not really working on that PTSD part of it, it's going to make recovery from that TBI much more difficult. So what do we do with this? Again, treatment for emotional dysregulation is psychotherapy, the big one, with or without EMDR therapy. So doing some sort of psychotherapy, just talk therapy in itself, can be very beneficial. When you're working with those therapists, some of them are certified in art therapy, some in music therapy, some with EMDR. So you really need to make sure that you find someone that's a good fit for you. As with any kind of mental health needs, you need to find the right person. I went through 2 or 3 therapists before I found one that really kind of jived with me, and that's okay. Not everyone is going to be a good fit with everybody. So you need to find one that's going to be a good fit for you. And again, if you look at the research, it will tell you that psychotherapy and medications are usually better than one or the other alone. I am very sensitive to medications, so I was not a huge fan, but that is definitely an option if you are not somebody who's super sensitive to medications like me. Mood stabilizing medications can also be very helpful, and it doesn't have to be long-term. So when we're talking about recovery from TBI, it can be a matter of 3 to 6 months. You work on it, you get better, and you no longer need the medications. So it doesn't have to be a long-term thing with those, if you're one of those people who really doesn't like medications. I'm not anti-medication. I am medication at the right time, the right place, for the right amount of time. So therapy with or without medications, with or without the EMDR part, is going to be really helpful for those issues with emotional dysregulation following TBI. And we've got one more big topic to cover when we come back from the break here on AM 950 Radio. Welcome back from the break again here on AM 950 Radio with Recharging the Human Battery. Dr. Sinacropi is out today. You've been listening to me, Mandi Dickey, nurse practitioner, talking about the ABCs of concussion again today, picking up on that series again. On to letter E today. So all the topics we've talked about today started with the letter E. Again, if you're just tuning in now, please do go back and listen to the whole show because it's been a really good one as usual. And if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, take a peek at them as well, because this whole series is about education, which is my last E topic letter for today, actually. But educating everyone, the public, other healthcare providers, whoever might be on the other side of this radio or computer or wherever you are listening to this episode, because, again, concussion is really, really a big thing in our country that we don't think about. 1 in 4 adults is walking around with some level of traumatic brain injury. Again, concussion being a mild traumatic brain injury, and mild in the sense of the fact that you didn't lose consciousness, you weren't in a coma, you weren't on tubes keeping you alive. That's really kind of the only big differentiating factor there. Mild does not mean you had mild symptoms. Mild does not mean the symptoms go away completely on their own for all people. Because as we've talked about today, 30% of people that have a traumatic brain injury will have continued symptoms. And this is not something that everybody gets over in a matter of weeks, as we used to think. There is a lot of new evidence out there, new information, and the symptoms of concussion can be wide and varied, which is why I'm able to have a whole series doing the ABCs of concussion, because there are a lot of things that are related to it. So any of these symptoms or things that I talk about would be affected by somebody that has a TBI. Some of them are not specific to TBI or brain injury, but some of them are fairly specific. But again, if you are somebody that has experienced a brain injury and you have any of these symptoms that are still lingering, you certainly can still talk to somebody. It's never too late to get treatment. Every time you kind of reach a new plateau, I have found that it's a time to add a different kind of therapy and try something new to help me get better. So that's kind of how I've found it. So this last E topic then for today is education. The big thing that I'm doing with this whole series is education. And education on this front, I mean from multiple levels. Educating the patient, so the person that has the symptoms, educating the public in general as to what kind of problem this is for our society, and then educating providers so that we do a better job caring for people that have injuries. So for the patient themselves, when you are educating a patient, you need to make sure you educate them to the level that they are at, not the level they were prior to their injury, but the level that they are at now. What is their current level? My neurological chiropractor, I think one of my favorite things that he had me do was have me take out my phone and record him when he was giving me directions on the exercise that he wanted me to work on. And this was brilliant and something that I intend to bring into my practice so that patients feel like they can have open conversations, they can remember things, so they can refer back to it later. My husband couldn't come with me to appointments for a long time, and I couldn't relay back to him what happened at those appointments because I couldn't remember them. So it's something that, as a provider, it's really important to keep that as an open mind and something as a possibility for your patients to do. Again, education for the patient needs to be done ideally in bullet points rather than long paragraphs or booklets, because when somebody has cognitive difficulties, it's really hard to follow a lengthy written material that's given to them. So I was given a lot of handouts at different times, and it's really hard to read all of those. Bullet points are much easier, but those long paragraphs, not so much. Even the Brain Injury Alliance of Minnesota sent out a bunch of pamphlets, and I had to hand them to my husband and have him help me read them. Be ready to repeat information to those patients as well, because concise information over and over is very important. To the public, you need to clarify what concussions look like, and that's the whole point of this show. What are the consequences of not treating it? Where to go for help? And we need to work on that stigma so that people feel okay saying, hey, I've had a brain injury and what can I do? And to the healthcare providers listening, again, I urge you to look into some education, some continuing education options outside of your practice area so that you can be up to date on all of these changes that I've been talking about week to week also. So thank you guys so much for being here. See you next time on AM 950 Radio with Recharging the Human Battery.